Sophia Hartwell had spent most of her life believing that admiration was her birthright. Since childhood, she had been the daughter people noticed first, the young woman whose beauty attracted attention before she ever opened her mouth. Guests remembered her. Gentlemen sought introductions to her. Mothers pointed her out to their sons. Over time, she had grown so accustomed to being the center of every room that she no longer questioned it. That was why the scene unfolding outside the Hartwell residence felt almost unbearable. From inside her carriage, Sophia watched 3 dukes leave her sister's house one after another. While curious neighbors crowded the street and whispered excitedly among themselves, every conversation seemed to revolve around Eleanor. Not Sophia, Eleanor. The older sister whom society had spent years dismissing. The sister people once pitied. The sister who had quietly stood in the background while Sophia accepted compliments, invitations, and proposals that seemed to arrive effortlessly. For the first time in her life, Sophia felt invisible. The realization settled in her chest like poison. By the following morning, news of the extraordinary gathering at the Hartwell residence had spread throughout London. Drawing rooms buzzed with speculation. Newspapers hinted at mysterious developments involving several prominent noble families. Even people who had never met Eleanor Hartwell suddenly found themselves discussing her future. Naturally, no one discussed anything else. Meanwhile, Eleanor wished they would. The sudden attention exhausted her. She had spent years avoiding society's scrutiny, only to find herself trapped beneath a far brighter spotlight than before. Every invitation that arrived at the house seemed motivated by curiosity rather than friendship. Every visitor wanted information. Every conversation eventually returned to the same question: which duke would she choose? The answer remained frustratingly simple: she had no idea. In truth, Eleanor was still trying to understand how any of this had happened. Over the next several weeks, William, Adrian, and Nathaniel each visited the Hartwell estate regularly. Though their approaches could not have been more different. William often brought his young daughter Charlotte, who immediately brightened whenever Eleanor entered a room. Watching the child race across gardens or proudly show off her latest drawings reminded Eleanor of simpler years before illness and responsibility had consumed so much of her life. There was something comforting about William's presence. He never rushed conversations or pressured her into decisions. Instead, he seemed content simply to spend time with her, as though friendship itself held value. Adrian, on the other hand, brought energy wherever he went. His stories filled entire afternoons. He teased Eleanor whenever she became too serious and possessed an almost irritating ability to make her laugh when she least expected it. Beneath his confidence, however, she gradually discovered a man far more thoughtful than society believed. The wealth and influence that surrounded him had not entirely erased his appreciation for ordinary kindness. Nathaniel remained the most difficult to understand. While the other 2 dukes openly expressed admiration, Nathaniel rarely spoke about feelings at all. Instead, he listened. He noticed things. Small things. He remembered details from conversations weeks earlier. He asked questions nobody else thought to ask. He paid attention in a way that occasionally left Eleanor feeling strangely exposed. Not because he judged her, but because he seemed determined to understand her. Unfortunately, Sophia had no intention of allowing this peaceful arrangement to continue. The more attention Eleanor received, the more desperate Sophia became to reclaim it. At first, her efforts were subtle. She appeared unexpectedly during William's visits. She arranged chance encounters with Adrian. She ensured Nathaniel encountered her at every social gathering she attended. The strategy would have worked perfectly in previous years. It failed completely. William remained polite but distant. Adrian treated her with the same courtesy he showed every guest. Nathaniel barely seemed to notice she was present. The realization humiliated her. Worse still, it made her angry. Sophia had spent her entire life believing she could win anyone's attention if she truly wanted it. Watching 3 powerful men consistently choose Eleanor over felt less like rejection and more like an attack on her identity. Eventually, frustration gave way to resentment. Resentment gave way to bitterness. And bitterness led Sophia toward a decision she would later regret. The opportunity arrived during Lady Ashbury's annual spring ball, one of the most anticipated social events of the season. Nearly every influential family in London attended. By the time Eleanor arrived accompanied by William, Adrian, and Nathaniel, whispers were already spreading through the ballroom. Heads turned. Conversations stopped. People stared openly. Eleanor had never enjoyed being the center of attention, and tonight was no exception. Yet something had changed. Months earlier, she would have lowered her gaze and endured the scrutiny in silence. Now she simply lifted her chin and continued walking. The difference did not go unnoticed. Neither did the three dukes surrounding her. Sophia watched from across the ballroom, her expression carefully composed. Then she made her move. The moment came during supper when a large crowd had gathered near the ballroom's central staircase. Conversations flowed easily until Sophia's voice rose above the noise. Perhaps there is something I still don't understand. The smile reminded Eleanor of countless childhood memories. None of them pleasant. If my sister is truly as extraordinary as everyone now claims, why did nobody want to marry her for 10 years? Because despite everything that had happened, Sophia had voiced the question society still secretly asked itself. Eleanor felt heat rise in her face. Not because she was ashamed. Because she was tired. Tired of defending her life. Tired of explaining sacrifices people refused to understand. Before she could respond, William rose from his chair. The movement alone commanded attention. "You are mistaken, Lady Sophia." No one failed to see Eleanor's worth. Many simply lacked the patience to understand it. My daughter loves Lady Eleanor because she treated a lonely child with kindness when she had nothing to gain from it. That alone tells me more about her character than 100 society seasons. His expression carried none of its usual humor. 7 years ago, Lady Eleanor risked her life to save a stranger trapped inside a burning carriage. Several guests turned toward Eleanor in shock. Adrian's gaze never left Sophia. She never asked for recognition. Never asked for reward. In fact, she disappeared before anyone could thank her. Unlike the others, he spoke softly. Yet somehow every person in the room heard him. I find it remarkable that society spent a decade asking why Eleanor never married. Almost nobody thought to ask whether society deserved her. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt something she had almost forgotten: pride. Not pride in attracting powerful men. Not pride in becoming the subject of gossip. Pride in the life she had lived. Pride in the sacrifices she had made. Pride in herself. And as she looked around the ballroom, she realized something extraordinary. The people who once pitied her were now avoiding her gaze. The people who once mocked her suddenly seemed uncertain. The story society had told about Eleanor Hartwell for 10 years was finally beginning to collapse. And this time there would be no rebuilding it. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of music, polite conversation, and stunned glances that followed Eleanor wherever she went. Yet for the first time in many years, those glances no longer carried pity. They carried curiosity, respect, and in some cases, embarrassment. Several women who had once laughed behind her back suddenly seemed eager to speak with her. Others offered compliments that would have felt sincere had they not arrived 10 years too late. Eleanor accepted them all with the same quiet courtesy. Not because she had forgotten the past, but because she no longer needed revenge. That realization surprised her. Months earlier, she might have dreamed of seeing society humbled. She might have imagined the satisfaction of watching those who mocked her become uncomfortable. Instead, she felt strangely calm, as though she had finally set down a burden she had carried for too long. Unfortunately, not everyone was ready to do the same. Sophia left the ball early that evening. No dramatic confrontation. No public scene. Only a smile stretched so tightly across her face that it looked painful. Eleanor watched her depart and felt a flicker of sadness. Because beneath all the rivalry, beneath all the jealousy and years of quiet cruelty, Sophia was still family. Or at least she had once been. The next morning proved that Sophia had not accepted defeat nearly as gracefully as she had appeared. The first rumor began circulating before noon. By evening, it had spread through half of London. According to the story, Eleanor had deliberately manipulated 3 powerful men by presenting herself as a tragic heroine. She had exaggerated her sacrifices, hidden her ambitions behind false humility, and spent years cultivating sympathy. The rumor was ridiculous. Unfortunately, society had never required logic to enjoy gossip. Eleanor learned of it when Lady Ashbury arrived unexpectedly at the Hartwell estate. Looking equal parts offended and fascinated. "I don't believe a word of it, of course," she said. Which was exactly the sort of thing people said before repeating every detail. Eleanor listened patiently, then smiled. "Thank you for letting me know." After she left, Eleanor turned to the library and continued reading as though nothing had happened. That evening, Nathaniel arrived for tea. The moment he entered the room, he seemed to sense something was different. "You've heard. I assume you're referring to today's rumor rather than yesterday's." "Fair point. It doesn't matter." "That isn't true." Most people encouraged her to ignore such things. Nathaniel rarely chose the easy answer. "It matters because someone is trying to hurt you." Rain drifted softly across the garden outside. Yet beneath the calmness, she sensed something else. Anger. Not for himself. For her. The realization unsettled her. No one had ever seemed angry on her behalf before. Nathaniel leaned back slightly. "When you spend enough time being mistreated, you begin believing you should simply tolerate it. And what would you suggest instead?" Instead, she found herself staring at him. Because for reasons she could not entirely explain, those words affected her far more than they should have. Perhaps because he believed them. Sophia arrived at the Hartwell estate late one afternoon, clearly expecting to find Eleanor alone. Instead, she discovered Nathaniel sitting in the drawing room. For the first time in her life, Sophia appeared genuinely nervous. She recovered quickly. Years of practice had made her an expert at that. "Eleanor. I hoped we might speak. I can leave if you'd prefer privacy." Unfortunately for Sophia, he sat back down. "I've changed my mind." Eleanor nearly felt sorry for her. Nearly. "What did you want to discuss?" Eleanor asked. Sophia clasped her hands together. For the first time, she seemed uncertain. That alone felt strange. Eventually, she spoke. "I think we've allowed misunderstandings to grow between us." Which usually meant he was restraining himself. Eleanor folded her hands in her lap. "What sort of misunderstandings?" "The sort that happen when sisters compete." As though the last 10 years had been a game. As though Eleanor had willingly participated. Nathaniel spoke before she could. "I wasn't aware Lady Eleanor had been competing." "I beg your pardon?" Competition generally requires both people to be aware it's happening. Eleanor lowered her eyes to hide a smile. Sophia looked as though she had been slapped. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then something inside Sophia finally cracked. Not dramatically, not loudly, just enough. Tears filled her eyes. Real tears. Not the carefully controlled ones she displayed at social events. "I didn't think it mattered." Sophia looked down at her hands. "When we were children, everyone adored Eleanor." She had never expected those words. Never. Sophia laughed bitterly. "Father did. And I hated it. When people began noticing me instead, I didn't want to lose it." But an insecure girl who had spent her entire life chasing validation. The realization didn't excuse what Sophia had done, but it explained it. "I told myself it was harmless. Then I kept going. There was nothing left to say. The truth sat plainly between them. At last, Sophia stood. I don't expect forgiveness." Because she genuinely didn't know what she felt, Sophia looked toward the door. Then back at her sister. "I was wrong." And for the first time in a decade, Eleanor felt something close to peace. Not because Sophia had apologized. Because the truth no longer needed defending. It had finally spoken for itself. Nathaniel watched the door close behind her. Then looked at Eleanor. "You know," he said quietly, "that may have been the most difficult thing she's ever done." "Probably." The afternoon sunlight stretched across the room. The house felt unusually quiet. Comfortably quiet. Then Nathaniel broke the silence. "Eleanor." What remained felt infinitely more dangerous. Because it looked very much like love. And suddenly Eleanor realized that choosing between three dukes had never been the hardest part of this story. The hardest part would be deciding whether she was finally brave enough to let herself be loved. For several days after Sophia's visit, Eleanor found herself thinking about the conversation. Far more often than she expected. Not because it had changed the past. Nothing could do that. The years they had lost could not be recovered. The wounds left by countless small cruelties would not disappear overnight. Yet for the first time since their childhood, Eleanor felt as though she finally understood her sister. That understanding did not erase the pain. But it softened it. And perhaps that was enough. Life gradually settled into a rhythm once more, though it was hardly the quiet life Eleanor had known before. Invitations continued arriving. Society remained fascinated by the unprecedented situation surrounding her. Every gathering she attended inevitably became the subject of speculation. Which duke would she choose? The question followed her everywhere. Unfortunately, it was a question Eleanor still could not answer. The more time she spent with William, Adrian, and Nathaniel, the more impossible the decision seemed. William represented comfort, stability, and kindness. She admired the way he treated his daughter, the way he listened before speaking, and the quiet strength that had carried him through grief. Adrian brought joy wherever he went. He reminded her that life could still contain laughter even after disappointment. Around him, the future seemed exciting rather than frightening. And then there was Nathaniel. Nathaniel remained the problem she could not solve. Because unlike the others, he had somehow become part of her daily life without her noticing when it happened. He appeared in ordinary moments, like afternoon walks through the gardens. Conversations beside the library fireplace. Quiet discussions about books, family, and the strange ways people carried loneliness. He never demanded her attention. Never competed for it. Yet somehow she found herself looking for him whenever he was absent. The realization unsettled her. Because deep down, she already suspected what it meant. One evening, nearly 2 months after the three dukes had first arrived at her home, Eleanor attended a charity gala hosted by the Duchess. The event was intended to raise funds for orphaned children, but as with most charitable events in London, it quickly became an opportunity for wealthy guests to observe one another. The ballroom glittered beneath hundreds of candles. Music drifted softly through the air. Laughter echoed across polished marble floors. And for the first hour, everything seemed perfectly pleasant. Then Eleanor overheard a conversation she was never meant to hear. She had stepped onto a quiet balcony to escape the crowd when 2 older women entered. From the opposite side, unaware she was standing nearby. "I still don't understand why she's taking so long. If I had 3 dukes waiting for an answer, I'd choose immediately. Perhaps she's enjoying the attention." Then came the remark that hurt far more, "Oh please. Women like her don't usually get opportunities like this. If she refuses for much longer, they'll eventually lose interest." Because for the first time, she realized something uncomfortable. A part of her feared they might be right. Not about the attention. Not about the dukes. About herself. For years, she had become accustomed to putting other people first. She knew how to care for others. She knew how to sacrifice. She knew how to endure disappointment. What she did not know was how to believe she deserved happiness. The thought followed her home. It lingered the next morning. And by evening, it had become impossible to ignore. When Nathaniel arrived unexpectedly that night, he immediately noticed something was wrong. "You've been thinking." Nathaniel took the chair opposite hers. For several moments, neither spoke. Then Eleanor set the book aside. "Can I ask you something?" Yet suddenly, she needed to hear the answer. "Why me?" "Not because I helped someone years ago." "Why me?" Then he stood and walked slowly toward the window. Outside, darkness covered the gardens. Inside, only the firelight illuminated the room. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of its usual certainty. "Do you know what the first thing I noticed about you was? I noticed that everyone underestimated you. They saw a woman who spent her life caring for others and assumed she must be weak. They saw kindness and mistook it for fragility. I spent years surrounded by people trying to impress. You were the first person I'd met in a long time who wanted absolutely nothing." Emotion tightened unexpectedly in her chest. "You make me sound better than I am." Then stopped directly in front of her. "No. I think you've spent so many years believing you're not enough that you've forgotten how remarkable you are." Because they touched the wound she had carried for most of her life. The wound left by rejection, comparison, neglect. Years spent believing she would always be second choice. Nathaniel knelt beside her chair. The gesture startled her. Slowly he reached for her hand. Not dramatically. Not possessively. Simply as though it belonged there. "Eleanor." Then Nathaniel spoke the words she had somehow known were coming. "I love you." Eleanor felt tears fill her eyes. Not because she was surprised. Because she wasn't. Some part of her had known for weeks. Perhaps months. What shocked her was the realization that hearing those words did not frighten her. It felt like coming home. And as she looked into Nathaniel Blackwood's eyes, Eleanor finally understood. Something that had taken her 10 years to learn. She had spent her entire life waiting for someone to choose her. But real love had never been about being chosen. It was about being seen. And for the first time in her life, she felt truly seen. For several seconds after Nathaniel's confession, neither of them spoke. The world beyond the library seemed to disappear entirely. The crackling fire. The distant sound of rain against the windows. The ticking clock on the mantel. Everything faded into the background. Only one thought remained. Nathaniel loved her. After all the years she had spent believing herself unremarkable. After all the seasons she had watched other women become wives while society quietly decided her future had already passed. The words felt almost impossible to comprehend. Eleanor lowered her gaze to the hand still resting in his. His grip was steady, comforting, patient. He was not demanding an answer, not expecting one, simply giving her the truth, and allowing her to decide what to do with it. The realization made her chest ache. Because no one had ever given her that kind of freedom before. For so long, her choices had revolved around responsibility. There had always been someone who needed her. Someone who depended upon her. Someone whose happiness came before her own. Now, for the first time, the choice belonged entirely to her. The thought was both wonderful and terrifying. Nathaniel seemed to understand, as he always did. Slowly, he released her hand and rose to his feet. "You don't have to answer tonight." His expression remained calm, though she could see the vulnerability beneath it. "I know." Then Nathaniel bowed his head slightly. "Good night, Eleanor." The door closed quietly behind him, leaving her alone with a heart that suddenly felt very different than it had only an hour earlier. The Hartwell residence received letters every day. What made this one remarkable was the seal, Ashcroft. Adrian. Eleanor unfolded the paper carefully. The message was brief. Far briefer than she expected from a man who usually spoke enough for 3 people. By the time she reached the final line, tears had gathered in her eyes. Not from sadness, but from gratitude. The letter contained no proposal, no attempt to persuade her, no declaration of love. Only honesty. Adrian wrote that he had known for some time what was happening between her and Nathaniel. He admitted that he had hoped otherwise for a while, but some truths eventually became impossible to ignore. Most importantly, he wrote that he valued her happiness more than his disappointment. The final sentence stayed with her long after she folded the letter. The right person should make your life feel lighter, Eleanor. I suspect Nathaniel has been doing that for months. Unlike Adrian, he arrived in person. Charlotte accompanied him, carrying a basket of flowers she had insisted on picking herself. The little girl raced into Eleanor's arms before William even entered the room. Eleanor hugged her tightly. For several moments, nobody spoke. Eventually, William smiled. I see I've already lost the competition. There was never a competition. There really wasn't. And somehow, that made it harder. William crossed the room and offered her a warm smile. I won't pretend I am delighted. But I am grateful. For what? You helped Charlotte when she needed someone. And whether or not you become my wife, I hope you know how much that means to me. Some people entered your life and left behind disappointment. Others left gratitude. William belonged firmly to the second group. Before leaving, he surprised her by placing a gentle kiss on her forehead. Not romantic. Not possessive. Only affectionate. The gesture of a friend saying goodbye to a possibility that had never quite become reality. Be happy, Eleanor. No. You won't have to try very hard. The sky glowed with the soft colors of sunset. For the first time in many years, the future no longer frightened her. It remained uncertain. But uncertainty no longer felt like loneliness. She paused beside the oldest rose bush on the property. The one her mother had loved most. A gentle breeze stirred the blossoms. And suddenly she remembered something. The final conversation they had shared. When I am gone, promise me you'll finally live for yourself. A sound behind her drew her attention. Footsteps. Steady. Familiar. She turned. Nathaniel stood at the edge of the path. For once, the usually composed Duke looked almost. The sight made her smile immediately. You're late. Late. As though he feared he might be mistaken. Eleanor. Years of believing she would never be someone's first choice. All of it suddenly felt very far away. When she finally stopped before him, her eyes shone with unshed tears. Not tears of sadness. Tears of relief. I spent so long believing nobody saw me. Eleanor. Even when I didn't see myself. And for the first time, Eleanor did not pull away from happiness. She stepped toward it. I love you too. As though allowing himself to believe it. Then he laughed. A genuine, unguarded laugh Eleanor had never heard before. Moments later, he drew her into his arms. And standing beneath the roses her mother had once cared for, Eleanor finally understood something that had taken nearly 30 years to learn. Her story had never been about finding a duke. It had never been about proving society wrong. It had never been about being chosen. It had been about learning that she had always been worthy of love. Even before anyone else recognized it. And perhaps that was why when Nathaniel kissed her beneath the fading evening light, it felt less like the beginning of a romance,